do you still include plant physiology in your course?
Let's take that first. Absolutely. Everybody's afraid that plants, while they have been demoted somewhat in the curriculum, they're still in there. And I think that if you look at the form and function chapters, I think that's chapters like 24 through 28, I believe, you've got all sorts of examples that you can bring into things that you've either already taught, or you can bring those in earlier on, like they were talking about with cell signaling. And certainly you can bring in the aspect of water potential and transport and gas exchange, even hormones and phytochromes, the way they, stimulate gene transcription. I think Ryan was alluding to that a little bit earlier, and circadian rhythms. One of the things we're supposed to be teaching is angiosperm reproduction, but I can't talk about angiosperms if I haven't given them a little bit of background about the evolution of plants in general and adaptations and things like chemical and physical defenses. So I guess it's all about trying to make those connections and use them as illustrative examples, not marching through the plant kingdom anymore like we used to, but to me it's all about making, those connections. And sort of the same thing when you're doing the animal physiology. There are certain systems that we're supposed to cover, but this book gives you a lot of great connections to what I call the lesser systems, like when there's a chapter on breathing. Well, there's a lot of illustrative examples in that chapter, even though the respiratory system itself is no longer within the scope of the curriculum. So there's a lot of good ways to tie it in.
And really, kind of taking a more modern approach to teaching biology, we're trying to teach our students how to think about the system, not so much about a particular cell or a particular organism. And plants are beautiful systems in terms of responding to their environment, in terms of growing and developing, in terms of different tissues differentiating at different times in a plant's life. They're just beautiful. I'm lucky. Lee and I are real lucky. We get to teach IB Bio in addition to AP Bio, and the IB curriculum still has a plant science unit. I mean, it's right there in the middle, and so I'm teaching all that good old seed germination. I'm teaching all the plant hormones, but I'm casting it in that AP Bio light because I know my kids will sit for the AP Biology exam as well. And I'm going to put a plug in for plants. I think that all of us should spend some time going back and reviewing our plant biology, because you will just recognize that they're just beautiful organisms that do amazing things. One more plug for plants. If you think about evolution, think C3, think C4, think CAM. There's a great opportunity to talk about essentially, increased number of genes, a heck of a lot more physiological complexity. There's a definite energetic cost to having all of those genes and proteins, but the benefit is you have the opportunity to survive and reproduce in places where other organisms can't. So you can really teach a lot of great, adaptations, and as Bobbie said, form and function, straight ahead ecology and evolution just using plants.
Yeah, I was going to say, and I weave it in throughout. I don't teach it as a separate unit. It shouldn't be taught separately because there are so many things that, there's so many places in your curriculum where plants fit. I introduce plants with, of course, with evolution and origins of life, and then we bring it back when we talk about biochem. We bring it back when we talk about, water movement, water potential. Right now we're in the middle of photosynthesis and respiration, and we've started our Fast Plants lab earlier this week. The kids got asked questions about germination. What is germination? What does it mean for plants, for seeds to germinate? What process can't they do right now since they're in the dirt? And we're going to, as we continue on with our genetics unit, plants are going to be all over this semester. The kids just don't know it yet. And so, I still include all of that stuff, but it's not as a separate standalone.
And our last question on this slide is, where are good resources practice on data analysis, experiment data 4 or 5?
Well, again, going to the teacher's edition of the book, every chapter's got a section on apply the concepts, teaching using the figures that are in the book, analyzing the data. It's all throughout the textbook, right there at your fingertips.
All right, we're a little short on time, so I'm going to move to the next question. Other than labs, what's the best advice for teaching students to prepare for photosynthesis and cellular respiration on the exam? I'm still relatively new at teaching AP Bio, but it seems like every year these topics are my weakest.
My answer is sort of short and sweet. Teach the basics of both of those processes and have the kids make the connections. Because ultimately on the exam, that's what they're, well, not necessarily make the connections between photosynthesis and respiration on the exam, but those are the types of questions that they're going to see. So if they understand the concepts, they should be able to make the connections. They're going to be given most anything they need to really know on the exam. It's just a matter of them being able to reply to the prompt, and if they can make those connections, they're going to be much more successful.
Have them uncover the relationship between the two processes, because to me, that's the most important thing. What is the relationship between those two? How do those two processes complement one another? What are the energetics involved in each of the, the energy transfers involved in each one of those processes? Don't give them blow-by-blow Krebs cycle. Don't give them blow-by-blow Calvin cycle. They don't need that. They need to see how are these two things related to each other. How do organisms who perform each one of these processes, what kind of relationships do they engage in? To me, that's the most important thing to teach my kids, and that's what I focus on with my students.
And additionally, I think that you really want to take a big picture approach to these two processes, thinking not only about photosynthesis and cell rest, but also about catabolism and anabolism, and thinking about fundamental thermodynamics. I mean, those are things that our students are weak in, and so when they get to these two sections, they see all these details that make no sense, but if you cast them in the light of basic energy transformations, as Lee said, it's going to make sense that a complex molecule like a carbohydrate will ultimately break down to carbon dioxide. That should yield enough energy to produce some ATP, which then the cell can use to do stuff. And that's really the black box piece in terms of what is ATP really used for. You'll notice that most books don't go into that. And to be perfectly honest, an AP Bio kid doesn't need to know that. That's for a 200 or 300 level cell biology class.
Mm-hmm.
One thing to think about, and I think all the adults in the room know this, but our students often forget that plants have mitochondria. So if you can work with your students to think conceptually about the flow of energy from solar to chemical, and really not to spend all night here, solar to, production of ATP via an electron transport chain, and then that ATP is used to convert something simple like carbon dioxide into something complex like a carbohydrate. And then those carbohydrates are either stored in the chloroplast or shunted to different places in the plant. Why? So that the plant's mitochondria can then use that chemical energy to produce ATP to grow and develop and repair tissues. And that, again, that's a long explanation, but you got to think about that energy flow. That stuff is inside of POL. It's inside of every good bio book, but you may want to do some of your own research. Go check out guys like Nick Lane and some of these other folks that have been thinking about thermodynamics and bioenergetics, and read what they have to say. And spend some time, if that's your weakest area of preparation, then spend some time reading about those topics and thinking about how they make sense to you and your students. When I was first year, I saw this stuff, I totally flipped out. I'm like, I barely remember that from college. But I thought about my kid, converting breast milk into biomass and growing hair and having to get a haircut. And I sort of cast in the light of a developing child. That made sense to me. And now, if you know me, I love this stuff. It's like the most interesting thing because once you break through a threshold, you start to recognize these energy transformations occurring along membranes within organelles, within cells. It's just absolutely fascinating. I mean, it never ceases to inspire me.